Hey folks, tonight we're diving headfirst into a subject that literally shaped the landscape of Europe and occasionally squashed a few invaders in the process. Medieval castles. But before you get too cozy, take a second to like and subscribe. Not because I told you to, but because if you make it through this much stonework and siegecraft, you probably belong here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Bonus points if you're near an actual castle, or a hill pretending to be one. Now, back to the real stars. The castles. Before they were scenic ruins perfect for postcards, fantasy films, or proposals gone wrong, castles were Europe's way of saying, we're done trying diplomacy. After the fall of Rome, the West hit a reset button so hard it forgot how plumbing worked. Civilization didn't collapse overnight. It took a nap. For a few centuries. And when it woke up, it had a sword in one hand and fleas in the other. It was chaos, ambition, and hygiene-based despair. Land was everything. If you had land, you were a target. And if you were a target, you'd better build some walls. Fast. And so someone had a bright idea: take a hill, put a wooden house on it, fence it in, and call it a fort. Thus, the Motte and Bailey was born. Imagine a breadstick on a bump surrounded by a picket fence. That was the best defense money and mud could buy. These early forts were the duct tape of the Middle Ages. Quick, cheap, and functional, until they met fire, wind, or a goose in a particularly bad mood. Seriously, a strong gust could do what some raiders couldn't. They were, to be kind, temporary. Builders knew it. Raiders knew it. Birds probably knew it. And eventually, someone realized that if you want your home to survive an angry neighbor with a torch, maybe, just maybe, don't make it out of sticks. Enter stone. Glorious, stubborn, immovable stone. Stone was the medieval upgrade patch no one asked for but desperately needed. It didn't burn. It didn't rot. It didn't squeak when a squirrel ran across the roof. It just stood there, ominous, cold, and very, very serious. But stone came with a price tag. A castle in stone wasn't a weekend project. It took decades, hundreds of laborers, masons, engineers, and more patience than any lord ever had. But that was fine. Most of them weren't going anywhere. When you finished your stone keep, you didn't just own a house. You declared dominion. It was like posting online. I run this valley. I probably have divine favor. And yes, my walls are thicker than your ego. And no one embraced this more than the Normans. After conquering England in 1066, they built castles with the energy of someone trying to impress their therapist. Castles went up everywhere. Sometimes to claim territory, other times just to scare the locals. And it worked. Within a century, over 1,000 stone castles dotted England's hills and coastlines, shouting in stone, "Welcome to feudalism. Your comfort has been downgraded." These early stone keeps weren't cozy. They weren't even friendly. Imagine a cave, but colder, a prison, but damper, windows smaller than your phone screen. No bathrooms, no heating, just rock, authority, and maybe the sound of your peasants regretting everything. But they worked. Thick stone walls said what no diplomat could. Don't even try. They outlived lords, wars, and sometimes logic. In a way, the evolution from wood to stone mirrors medieval Europe itself, from fleeting and chaotic to brutally permanent. The wooden fort was a shrug at fate. The stone castle was a middle finger to anyone who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. But soon, lords realized that being safe was great, looking powerful, even better. How to flex with granite. You see, once lords figured out how to not get invaded, they set their sights on something even more important than survival: status. Because what's the point of building a castle if it doesn't scream, "I'm richer than you, I'm more paranoid than you, and God probably likes me more too"? In the age before Instagram, The only way to show off was to carve your confidence into a mountainside. No filters, just fortifications. Every tower, every battlement, every spire was a flex. A very expensive, very heavy, and very cold flex. Because yes, castles got competitive. Lords weren't just trying to keep invaders out anymore. They were trying to outdo each other. Bigger walls, taller towers, moats so deep they were practically medieval metaphors for insecurity. And so began the arms race of architecture. Nobles funneled mountains of money and even more mountains of unpaid labor into their vanity projects. The results? Skyscrapers of stone for men terrified of irrelevance. If your neighbor had a 4-story keep, you built 5. If his battlements were 10 feet thick, yours were 12, and possibly filled with spite. If he had a moat, you had 2, with spikes. This wasn't military genius. It was ego warfare with a construction budget, and the victims weren't enemy armies. They were peasants. Because every time a lord decided to build another tower, it wasn't just stone that was hauled up the hill. It was food, timber, tax revenue, and the collective will to live. Meanwhile, entire villages were left staring up at the castle thinking, "So, this is where my harvest went." And lords loved it. Every morning they could stand on a high balcony, look down on the fields, and bask in the satisfaction of knowing that everyone below had a sore neck from looking up. It was vertical power, and they wanted it visible. That was feudalism in practice. The peasants worked, the nobles built, and everyone pretended it was God's plan. But let's be honest, not every lord was a tactical mastermind. Many were just rich guys with trust issues and bad taste. They didn't always build for strategy. Some built castles in bogs, or on cliffs, or in places where it rained so much, even the moat gave up and turned into soup. Why? Because it looked dramatic. Because a silhouette on a hilltop was more important than whether your servants could carry dinner to your room without needing climbing gear. And the insides? Oh, even worse. No plumbing, no heating, constant drafts, and a layout that seemed specifically designed to confuse invaders and also residents. Most lords spent their time not worrying about enemy armies, but about their own staff. Think about it. Your cook knows where the knives are. Your steward knows where the wine is. That's too much power for someone unpaid and underfed. So they built fortifications inside the house. Locked doors, hidden passages, arrow slits aimed at the dining hall just in case dinner got too ambitious. And yet, out of this paranoia came some of the most iconic structures in European history. A well-built castle could employ hundreds, masons, blacksmiths, carpenters, rope makers, and at least one guy whose job was yelling at everyone else to move faster. And the process? Absolute chaos. No blueprints, no architects in the modern sense. Just a lord yelling, "Make it taller," and a group of engineers standing in the rain hoping gravity stayed on their side. Apprentices held plumb lines while their masters argued about angles. Foundations were guessed. Heights were eyeballed. Sometimes entire sections had to be rebuilt when someone realized the stairs ended in midair. And yet somehow they worked. These structures, born of ego, anxiety, and trial-and-error craftsmanship, have outlived empires. Castles became the signature of the medieval world, not because they were comfortable, but because they made a point written in stone. Build high, build heavy, and whatever you do, make sure the neighbors can see it. The hill will kill you before the arrows. Do. If you're going to build a fortress, medieval logic said, build it somewhere no one wants to visit. Bonus points if getting there feels like punishment for something you didn't do. Hence the favorite choice of real estate for castle builders, the hill. Steep, muddy, windy, and miserable, which is precisely why it worked. The reasoning was simple. Gravity doesn't get tired, it doesn't sleep, and it never needs to be paid. It's the ultimate unpaid bodyguard. Every foot an attacker climbed uphill drained their energy and enthusiasm. By the time they reached the castle gate, they were out of breath, out of options, and probably reconsidering their career choices. From up high, you saw your enemies long before they reached you, which gave you time. Time to prepare, or just time to mock them from the battlements. Lords loved that part, the psychological warfare of pointing downhill and saying, "You can try, but you'll regret it halfway up." The higher the castle, the greater the smugness. But here's the thing about putting your home on a hill. Someone has to build it, and that someone wasn't the lord. It was the workers, the oxen, the unlucky servants, the poor stonemason whose idea of career growth now involved dragging boulders up a slope that even goats looked at and said, "No thanks." Imagine carrying barrels of water, carts of timber, or lunch for the lord across 3 terraces, up 200 stairs, and over a drawbridge, only to be told the master wasn't hungry, and to hurry back with dessert. Oxen would make the climb once, maybe twice. By the 3rd trip, they were contemplating vegetarianism and early retirement. But the view, oh, the view was glorious. If you could see through the fog permanently glued to your rooftop. From below, the castle looked divine, majestic, like a god had decided to drop a mountain on top of another mountain and carve windows into it. From above, it was damp, drafty, and made you question your life choices. And not all hills were created equal. Some castles weren't even on hills. They were on cliffs, ridges, or rocky outcrops that barely qualified as stable. A few were built in places so inaccessible it was unclear whether the castle was defending the land or just trying to escape from it. But medieval lords were obsessed with altitude. It wasn't just tactical, it was theatrical. Your castle needed to be seen. Not reached, just seen. Like a medieval status update carved in limestone. And make no mistake, elevation was about power, not just protection. It was a visual hierarchy. The castle above, the peasants below, literally. A reminder baked into the landscape that you live down there, and I rule from up here. In the social ecosystem of feudal Europe, verticality mattered. Climbing the hill to your lord's door wasn't just physically exhausting, it was spiritually humbling. You arrived sweating, gasping, and already halfway submissive. That was the design. The hill was the first line of defense, not just against armies, but against equality. But even the mighty hill needed help, and that help came in the form of what might be the most ambitious puddle in history: the moat. Because if gravity wasn't enough to ruin your day, how about a trench full of regret? The moat. Because nothing says luxury like a giant mud hole. Nothing says stay out quite like a watery trench full of mosquitoes, dead fish, and questionable life decisions. That's right. We're talking about the moat, also known as Europe's most determined ditch. The moat was the medieval version of a home security system. Expensive, hard to maintain, and only useful if you ignored the smell. But oh, what a statement it made. In theory, the idea was brilliant. You surround your castle with water, and boom, no ladders, no siege towers, no friendly neighborhood invaders. The water made scaling the walls nearly impossible. Mud sucked up your shoes, horses panicked, soldiers slipped, flailed and sank. It was medieval landscaping with a personal grudge. But like most brilliant medieval ideas, reality showed up wearing disappointment. Most moats weren't glistening blue ribbons, serenely encircling majestic stone. No, they were filthy, filled with stagnant sludge, mold, and things you hoped were just plants. They were mosquito theme parks in summer and icy death traps in winter. In spring, they overflowed. In fall, they stank. And during a siege, oh boy, forget the invaders. Livestock drowned in them, defenders slipped into them. Rain turned them into swamp soup. And if your castle didn't have a natural spring or nearby river to fill the moat, congrats. You just dug a giant empty ditch. A ditch that judged you silently, season after season. But despite the smell, the bugs, and the logistics nightmare, moats stayed popular. Because while they weren't always practical, they were psychologically devastating. Imagine being an attacker. You haven't even touched the enemy's wall, and you're already stuck, wet, cold, and being laughed at from a distance. Arrows rain down, rocks fall, and if the defenders were feeling especially theatrical, maybe they hurled dinner scraps too. Because why waste a chance to insult someone and compost at the same time? Dry moats weren't better. If anything, they were worse. Filled with spikes, jagged rocks, or cleverly placed trip hazards, they turned your average Wednesday siege into an orthopedic emergency. Some castles even had double moats, because if one trench full of despair is good, then two must be great, and maintenance. Constant. Moats flooded, eroded, froze, attracted vermin, and smelled like divine punishment. Cleaning them was a task so miserable it was probably reserved for whoever lost a bet in the guardhouse. Still, every self-respecting lord wanted one. It was about image. Yes, I have a moat. No, I don't swim in it. Yes, it's full of questionable fluids. No, you can't cross it. Because a moat wasn't just a ditch. It was a boundary, a declaration, a really damp, really annoying way to say, I live here, you don't. Keep walking. And people believed it. In many cases, bandits and raiders never made it to the wall, not because they were defeated, but because they took one look at that soggy trench of despair and decided to loot a village instead. That's the genius of medieval defense. It didn't always need to stop you. Sometimes it just needed to demoralize you. The gatehouse, when the welcome mat is a trap door. You ever walk up to a place thinking, wow, this looks friendly, only to immediately regret all your life choices? That's the gatehouse. From a distance, it was majestic. Banners flying, towers flanking the drawbridge, sunlight glinting off polished stone like a medieval resort brochure. But walk a little closer, and suddenly, surprise! It's a kill box. The gatehouse was the ultimate architectural bait and switch. It pretended to be a front door. What it actually was, a trap with better interior design than most noble houses. Step 1. Cross the drawbridge. Step 2. Enter the tunnel. Step 3. Realize you've just walked into a hallway specifically designed to end your military career. Above, murder holes. Not poetic. Literal holes through which defenders could drop rocks, boiling water, hot sand, or if the budget was tight, whatever was heavy and nearby. Below, nothing but shame. On both sides. Narrow arrow slits turning that cozy stone tunnel into a blender operated by very enthusiastic crossbowmen. And if that wasn't enough, some castles had 2 or even 3 portcullises, just in case the first one failed to humiliate you properly. Imagine the scene. Your commander says, "Charge the gate." You run forward, proud and brave, only to find yourself inside a stone hallway shaped like anxiety. Then something hot lands on your helmet. Then your best friend gets hit by a bucket of gravel. And then the ceiling opens and someone drops an old sheep carcass just to mess with you. This was medieval hospitality at its finest, polite from afar, homicidal up close. But the madness doesn't stop there. You'd think this architectural hellhole was purely a death trap. Nope. The upper levels? Living quarters. That's right. The same space used to pour boiling oil on intruders was also where guards slept, ate, and wrote mildly traumatized diary entries. Can you imagine trying to get a good night's rest knowing that just below your floorboards is a room where people regularly scream and combust? But here's the genius. The gatehouse didn't just defend, it performed. It was a stage, a psychological play. The drawbridge said, "Come in." The gatehouse followed up with, "Just kidding." It was customer service with spikes, and the audience, Everyone on the battlements casually watching the intruders panic and roast. The message was clear. If this is how we treat guests, imagine what we do to enemies. In many ways, the gatehouse was the castle's personality test, and most attackers failed it in under 2 minutes. Stairs built to break spirits and ankles. You ever climb a staircase and think, why does this feel like a punishment? Welcome to medieval castle stairs, architectural marvels designed by sadists with a ruler and too much time. From the outside, the castle was majestic. From the inside, it was a twisting, narrow, spiraling vendetta against knees. Most of these stairs curled clockwise going up. Sounds innocent, right? Until you remember that nearly all soldiers back then were right-handed. That meant an attacker charging upward found their sword arm trapped against the inner wall, unable to swing freely. Meanwhile, the defender at the top, sword in right hand, full range of motion, gravity on their side, and possibly a few insults ready. It was physics with a grudge. And if you thought, maybe I'll just run really fast and dodge the attacks, well, good luck. Each step was uneven, on purpose. Tall rises, short treads, angles that made no sense. They were the medieval version of a captcha, but instead of verifying you weren't a robot, they verified you weren't going to survive. In peacetime, servants tripped on them. In wartime, soldiers died on them. Either way, the stairs got their satisfaction. Even worse, these staircases got narrower the higher you climbed. By the time you reached the top, you could barely fit yourself, let alone your dignity. And just when you thought you had the strategy figured out, some castles would reverse the spiral direction in different towers. Why? Confusion. Pure, glorious, strategic confusion. 1 minute your sword swings fine, the next it hits the wall, and then someone upstairs drops a brick on your helmet just to drive the lesson home. It wasn't just defense. It was psychological warfare with steps. And let's not forget, these weren't tucked away in a secret war chamber. These were the main stairs. Lords used them, servants used them. People carried food, water, armor, and chamber pots up and down these medieval vertigo machines every day. Slip once and you didn't just lose your tray, you risked a very public and bumpy descent into legend. But there was genius buried in the cruelty. Spiral staircases were space-efficient, wedged neatly into towers and turrets. Their design was mathematically elegant and militarily lethal. They were like stone tornadoes that hated invaders, and possibly everyone else. Some castles even had fake stairways, decoys that led nowhere, just to confuse and trap enemies. It wasn't enough to defeat an attacker. You had to exhaust, embarrass, and disorient them first, and it worked, because in the end, the staircase wasn't just a way to go up. It was a message. If the hill didn't stop you, the moat didn't drown you, and the gatehouse didn't crush you, maybe these stairs will finish the job. Arrow slits, the passive-aggressive eye of the castle. If you've ever walked through a medieval castle and wondered, why are the windows so tiny? Congratulations, you've just stumbled across the deadliest air vent in history. These weren't windows, they were arrow slits, and they turned castle walls into medieval sniper towers. Narrow on the outside, wide on the inside. The architectural equivalent of whispering, "I see you," without showing your face. From the exterior, they looked like thin cuts in stone, barely wide enough to slide a dagger through. But inside, they opened up like a funnel, giving archers room to aim, breathe, and sip their victory tea in peace while chaos unfolded outside. It was archery with confidence, casual homicide wrapped in geometry. You could fire arrows all day through one of these and stay practically invisible. Meanwhile, attackers could fire back with an entire rainstorm of arrows. And all they'd hit was stone. And they evolved. Oh yes, they evolved. As weapons improved, so did the slits. You got cross-shaped ones for crossbows, circular ones for early firearms, and angled designs for maximum coverage. each one tailor-made to ruin someone's day while keeping the defender perfectly smug and mostly unbothered. And let's be real, castle designers were having fun with this. Every arrow slit was an opportunity for performance. Defense as theater, battle as interior design. Some castles even had fake arrow slits carved into the wall, just to look more terrifying. That's right. They installed pretend death windows to make the place look extra uninviting. That's the kind of energy you bring when you want to win the war before it starts. But of course, everything in a castle is a trade-off. These slits let in no light, no fresh air, and definitely no sense of joy. Inside the castle, it was dark, cold, cramped. You'd bump into people, furniture, and sometimes despair long before you saw who was next to you. And when the enemy wasn't attacking, arrow slits just became rain funnels, or wind tunnels, or pigeon targets, whatever nature felt like doing that day. Yet they worked. A handful of archers behind good slits could hold off an entire army. Geometry doesn't care how many soldiers you brought. It only cares how many you'll have left after walking into that stone death trap. And while you're out there freezing, dodging arrows, and slipping in the moat, you look up and see a tiny slit in the wall. Just one. And from it comes a single arrow, and a single voice that seems to say, "Try your luck." The keep, cold stone, warm paranoia. At the center of every castle, past the moats, stairs, gatehouses, and strategically placed heartbreak, stood the keep. The last line of defense, the ultimate fallback. The place where nobility went when everything else had fallen apart. Think of it as Plan Z, when Plan A through Y had been flung from the battlements. The keep was not cozy, it was not cute. It was a fortress inside a fortress, a bunker dressed up like a castle's nervous system. Walls thick enough to muffle hope, doors heavy enough to require 3 people and a midlife crisis to move. No privacy, no warmth, just echoing stone corridors and the subtle stench of wet authority. At the top sat the Lord's chambers, because of course he wanted a view. Not for sunlight, not for inspiration, but to watch his enemies, and maybe his allies too, especially his allies. These towers doubled as bedrooms, war rooms, and paranoia platforms. From the parapets, lords would pace, muttering about loyalty, while their servants froze 2 stories below, trying to remember if betrayal was a fireable offense. But the real genius of the keep wasn't in its style, it was in its simplicity. If everything else failed, walls breached, gates smashed, morale shattered, you could shove everyone you halfway trusted into the keep and just wait. For help, for hunger, for history. You stockpiled food, weapons, and suspicion, maybe even some water, and if you were lucky, the well was inside the keep. If not, well, welcome to dehydration by design. From the top floors, defenders would fire arrows, throw rocks, and shout insults, often the only thing not in short supply. Some keeps even had trap doors in the upper floors, because if arrows failed, gravity never did. And yet, life in the keep was miserable. The fireplaces worked about as well as medieval toothpaste. Smoke went wherever it pleased. Rooms were always cold, and the one time they weren't, it was because the roof was on fire. Winters in the keep weren't a season, they were a sentence. You'd huddle for warmth, pray for spring, and eat stew so cold it applied for citizenship in the Arctic. But through all the misery, the keep stood. Solid, stoic, a granite monument to endurance. It wasn't built for luxury. It was built for outlasting your enemies, and maybe your friends too. To live in the keep was to accept the deal, safety in exchange for comfort, security wrapped in suffering. And if that sounds familiar, congratulations. You now understand medieval architecture, and possibly medieval marriage. Because a castle's heart wasn't full of warmth or joy. It was full of cold stone, dry bread, and the quiet voice of survival whispering, "Hold." Curtain walls, The medieval hug you died in. If the keep was the heart of the castle, then the curtain walls were its ribcage, thick, unyielding, and absolutely committed to making sure nothing got inside unless it was very polite or very persistent. Curtain walls were the big guns. Long, broad walls surrounding the inner castle like a hug made of stone, engineering, and sheer contempt for intruders. Unlike the thin palisades of the early Motte and Bailey days, curtain walls were thick, as in, we measured this wall in horse lengths. Thick. Sometimes 20 to 30 feet of stone layered up like medieval lasagna. It didn't bend. It didn't care. It just stood there, waiting for you to try something stupid. And people did. Siege engines were wheeled up. Ladders were thrown. Battering rams, catapults, even early cannons. None of it guaranteed success. Because curtain walls didn't just rely on stone, they relied on layers. You didn't build one wall, you built 2 or 3 or more. Because if the first wall broke, you still had one behind it. And if that broke, welcome to wall number 3. The "you really should have given up by now" edition. These layers weren't stacked neatly like nesting dolls. No, they were arranged to trap, confuse, and slow. Think of them as a medieval maze made entirely of pessimism and pessimism's stronger cousin, granite. And those towers spaced along the curtain? Not just for decoration, they let defenders fire sideways along the wall's edge. That's right. If you made it to the base of the wall, they didn't just shoot at you from the front. They shot at you from the side. Welcome to the worst group photo of your life. And if that wasn't enough, some curtain walls had chemin de ronde, narrow walkways along the top that let defenders move quickly from tower to tower, raining down arrows, rocks, or very aggressive shouting. But curtain walls weren't just defensive. They were also psychological warfare at scale. Approach a castle and see not one wall, but 3. Each taller and angrier than the last, and your brain starts filing paperwork for surrender before you even touch your sword. It's like the building itself is judging your life choices. And sometimes that was enough. You didn't need to fight a siege. You just needed to look like the kind of person who could afford to win one. Of course, building all of this cost a fortune, thousands of man-hours, tons of stone, rivers of silver. It was medieval bankruptcy with excellent masonry. But for lords who could afford it, the curtain wall was more than protection. It was a statement. You will not get in, and if you try, you will not leave. Siege warfare. When hope meets a rock to the face. So, you're standing in a field. In front of you, a castle the size of your self-doubt. Behind you, several hundred tired, hungry soldiers, half of whom forgot to pack lunch. What do? Welcome to siege warfare, where medieval armies tried to solve the problem of very large walls with very large objects on wheels. Let's start with the classic, the battering ram. Take a log. Add wheels. Cover it in wet hides so it doesn't catch fire. Then repeatedly smash it into a door while shouting encouragement and slowly losing cartilage in your shoulders. Sometimes it worked. Often the defenders poured boiling oil, hot sand, or disappointment on your head. If that didn't do it, try the siege tower. Imagine a wooden skyscraper filled with angry men, slowly rolled across open ground while being pelted with arrows, rocks, and possibly sarcasm. Once at the wall, a drawbridge drops, and the attackers charge across, assuming the tower isn't on fire, broken or emotionally defeated. And then there's the trebuchet, the pride of medieval engineering. A giant wooden arm flinging boulders, cows, or whatever message you wanted to send that day. It didn't just launch objects. It launched statements. Want to knock down a wall? Use a rock. Want to knock down morale? Launch a plague victim. Yes, that happened. History is creative like that. Some sieges skipped the drama and went full dig-dug. Tunneling under walls, called sapping, was slow, dirty, and required the kind of patience usually reserved for monks and parents of toddlers. The goal? Undermine the foundation until part of the wall collapsed in on itself. If done right, it was glorious. If done wrong, congratulations. You just invented a dungeon. And then there was the ultimate strategy. Waiting. Surround the castle. Cut off supplies. Wait for disease, famine, or sheer boredom to take its toll. The technical term? Starving them out. The real-world effect? Months of mud, monotony, and an alarming rise in stew-based diets. But don't think sieges were all blood and mud. They were also full of overconfidence. Attackers built ladders too short. Siege engines got stuck in ditches. Tunnels collapsed. And sometimes, defenders opened the gates not out of fear, but because the besiegers were more annoying than dangerous, and they just wanted it over with. Even when a siege succeeded, the cost was massive. Lives lost, cities ruined, treasuries emptied. Victory often felt like losing slower than the other guy. And castles, they adapted. Walls got thicker, towers got rounder to deflect projectiles. Gates got layered like onions and made attackers cry just as much. It became an arms race of futility. Siege warfare was never about winning fast. It was about outlasting your opponent's sanity. When castles retire, from war machines to wallpaper, every empire ends. Every wall crumbles, and eventually every castle gets tired of being dramatic. By the late Middle Ages, the very things that made castles terrifying, thick walls, high towers, and narrow gates, started to look old-fashioned. Not because they stopped working, but because gunpowder showed up and said, "Hey, nice wall, boom." Cannons didn't care about stone. Cannons didn't ask permission. They just fired, and entire centuries of architecture collapsed in an afternoon. Castles, once thought eternal, suddenly had an expiration date. Some lords tried to adapt. Thicker walls, lower profiles, angled bastions. But slowly, inevitably, castles stopped being homes of power and became homes of memory. They were abandoned, sold, or reused. Some became prisons, others stables. Many were left to the elements, wind, rain, and ivy, becoming their final conquerors. The stone that once screamed, "Do not approach," began to whisper, "Take a picture." Romantic poets and curious travelers arrived centuries later, seeing not fear but beauty. Cracked towers became backdrops for love stories. Arrow slits became scenic framing devices. Entire keeps were swallowed by moss and myth. Tourists arrived with cameras instead of torches. Artists sketched ruins under golden twilight. Historians tried to reconstruct what happened, and YouTubers turned them into click-worthy content. Castles had gone from fortresses to aesthetic ruins. But here's the twist. Even in decay, castles never stopped making statements. They still towered over fields, still cast long shadows, still said without speaking, "We were once unstoppable." Because castles weren't just buildings. They were ideology in stone, proof that humans will go to absurd lengths to defend what they love, fear what they can't control, and build what they hope will last forever. Even as ruins, they outlived empires. Even as skeletons, they told stories. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not just the wars they survived, but the centuries they watched pass by. After the fall, what castles left behind. When the cannons stopped firing, when the lords stopped building, and when the armies traded steel for signatures, castles didn't disappear. They waited. They stood silent on hilltops. Shadows of a violent past, monuments of stone and stubbornness. Long after the world moved on, castles remained, not because they were needed, but because they were too proud to collapse quietly. For centuries, people came back to them, not with swords, but with questions. What was life like here? Who stood on these walls? Whose blood darkened this stone? Villagers picked through the ruins. Children played in the courtyards. Shepherds rested under battlements that once bristled with arrows. And slowly, the stories returned, not as facts, but as legends. Because castles didn't just defend land. They defined memory. They became symbols of power, of pain, of perseverance. A broken tower wasn't a failure. It was proof that someone once stood high enough to fall. A flooded moat wasn't useless. It was a mirror, reflecting how far we've come and how much we've forgotten. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Romantics fell in love with ruins. They painted them, wrote poems about them, turned them into metaphors for lost glory and human fragility. Castles became icons, not of war, but of wistfulness. Today, we walk through their remains with smartphones and tour guides. We marvel at the stonework. We pose on crumbling stairs. We whisper in echoing halls and imagine the ghosts of a world that no longer exists. But some part of us, deep down, still remembers. The part that builds fences, that locks doors, that dreams of safety behind high walls, that feels pride in altitude and fear in exposure. Because the truth is, we haven't outgrown castles. We've just made them digital. Firewalls instead of curtain walls. Surveillance instead of archers. Panic rooms instead of keeps. The instinct is the same. Protect what matters. Make it visible. Make it intimidating. And when all else fails, retreat to the center, bar the gate, and wait. We may no longer build castles of stone, but in our minds, we never stopped. The castles within us. Why we keep building walls. Centuries after the last drawbridge creaked and the last arrow flew, castles still stand, not just on hillsides, but in our collective imagination. Because a castle was never just stone, it was never just strategy. A castle was a mirror. And if you look long enough, you start to see yourself in the reflection. Think about it. Every locked door we install, every password we forget, every do not disturb sign we hang. That's a castle wall. The keep became the safe room, the moat became the firewall, and the gatehouse. That's the login screen, daring you to try your luck. We don't dig trenches anymore. We draw boundaries, emotional ones, psychological ones, invisible moats filled with suspicion, memory, and maybe a little pride. We say, you can come this far, but no further, just like they did. Because deep down, we understand what those stone towers meant. To be vulnerable is terrifying, to be exposed is dangerous, and to be seen, truly seen, is a risk most aren't ready to take. So we build. Not with mortar, but with silence. Not with battlements, but with deflection and defense mechanisms. Not castles of stone, but castles of self. And sometimes we let people in, but only through the gatehouse. Only if they pass the tests, only if they can handle the murder holes. Figurative, of course. Mostly. And here's the tragic part. We don't just build castles to keep people out. We build them to trap ourselves in. The lonely lord pacing his high tower, that's us on a bad day. The moated keep stocked for a siege, that's us after heartbreak. The layers of walls, those are all the I'm fines we've ever said when we weren't. But maybe, just maybe, the lesson isn't to stop building castles. It's to learn when to lower the drawbridge. New castles, new kings, the architecture of power. Today, the castles are gone. But the instinct? Oh, it never left. We no longer build towers to house archers. We build them for billionaires. We no longer guard gates with drawbridges. We guard them with biometric scanners and NDAs. But make no mistake, we still build castles. Only now they have glass walls. Security cameras instead of murder holes. Boardrooms instead of great halls. Silence instead of trumpets. Where once lords rode horses across causeways, CEOs now stride across marble floors beneath chandeliers that sparkle like ambition. And where once peasants tilled the fields beneath a tower, today's workers scroll slack beneath skylines designed to impress, not shelter. Castles, reincarnated. And just like the originals, these new fortresses serve two purposes: keep people out, remind them who's in. The curtain walls became terms and conditions. The gatehouse became logins and lanyards. The throne became a corner office with views no one else can afford to look at. But power still looks down, and the rest of us still look up. But here's the twist. For all their grandeur, today's castles are more fragile than ever. They aren't made of granite. They're made of reputation, algorithms, clicks, and cloud storage. And those fall faster than stone ever did. No siege tower needed. Just a scandal, a breach, a trend shift, a tweet. In the digital age, the only trebuchet you need is public opinion. So, what does that mean for us? It means we're not just living through history, we're building it. Right now, every day, with every choice we make about who to follow, what to build, and how much of ourselves to defend or share. We can build new castles, ones that include instead of exclude, ones that protect without isolating, ones where strength doesn't mean walls, but bridges. Because the real legacy of the castle isn't its walls. It's the reminder that power is temporary, but stories last. The inner castle, how we fortify ourselves without knowing it. Close your eyes. Forget the stone. Forget the towers. Forget the drawbridges. Now picture a castle made of memory, not built on a hill, but on your past, not defended by archers, but by instincts, not filled with courtiers, but with every version of you that ever needed to feel safe. That's the inner castle, and we all have one. The walls we build. The first time someone hurt you, you built a wall, not of stone but of silence. The first time you were abandoned, you dug a moat, deep, cold, hard to cross. The first time you felt seen and it made you afraid. You raised a tower, high, isolated, watching everything, trusting nothing, and then you kept building. Room by room, fear by fear, you decorated the great hall with smiles you didn't mean. You placed your regrets in the dungeons where no one would look. You locked your dreams in the top tower, too fragile to release, too precious to destroy. You called it coping, but it was architecture, the gatekeepers of self. At the entrance to your inner world stands the gatekeeper. Sometimes it's anxiety, sometimes shame, sometimes it's a voice that whispers, "Don't let them in. You know what happened last time." The gatekeeper means well. It's been trained to protect you at all costs. But in doing so, it sometimes locks out joy, connection, even love. Because not every visitor is a threat. Not every drawbridge needs to be raised. Not every arrow needs to fly. But the castle doesn't know that yet. Exploring the keep deep within your inner stronghold lies the keep, the core. This is where your truth lives. Not the version you post, not the version you perform. The one that whispers at night when the battlements fall quiet. It's scared, it's sacred, and it's still waiting to be seen. Many never reach it. They get lost in the outer halls, distracted by echoes, ghosts, and portraits of who they used to be. But some brave souls, sometimes with help, find the courage to walk the winding staircase inward, to stand before the truth, to open the shutters, to let light in. And when that happens, something miraculous unfolds. The castle doesn't collapse. It softens. Lowering the drawbridge healing doesn't mean tearing the castle down. It means inviting people in, one by one, slowly, deliberately. It means trusting that some guests come not to pillage, but to sit, to listen, to stay. And maybe they bring warmth. Maybe they help you patch the cracks. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, you realize You were never meant to live alone in this fortress.
Castles we inherit, the architecture passed down through generations. We like to think we built our own castles, that every wall, every tower, every defense we have was our decision, our reaction, our scars. But here's the quiet truth. Some of our bricks aren't ours. Inherited stonework before you ever raised a wall, someone else had already laid the foundation. Maybe your father built with silence. Maybe your mother fortified with fear. Maybe your grandparents handed you battlements carved from war, displacement, poverty, or pride. And you were born inside those walls, not by choice, but by inheritance. You learned early where it was safe to speak, where it was dangerous to feel, where emotions were shelved like armor, displayed but never worn. You were handed blueprints for protection, but nobody asked if you wanted to build. The castle of culture and blood our families passed down many things, recipes, lullabies, heirlooms. But they also passed down hypervigilance disguised as caution, control disguised as tradition, avoidance disguised as strength, suppressed love disguised as duty. These are the invisible bricks of the emotional fortress, and like any good wall, they work, they protect, they endure, but sometimes they also trap. You find yourself pacing the same tower your father did, locking the same door your mother once bolted, carrying a key to a room you've never entered but have always feared, rebuilding or restoring. At some point you realize, this castle isn't mine, I just live here, and you're left with a choice: rebuild it, tear down what no longer serves, keep the archways of resilience, add skylights for joy, restore it, keep its essence but widen the gates, open new rooms, invite laughter where once there was only echo, walk away, leave the ruins, build something entirely your own, elsewhere, lighter, freer. But none of these are easy, because even inherited walls feel like home. Even inherited wounds feel like identity. Healing the line: what happens when one person in a lineage chooses to stop reinforcing the wall? They become the architect of change, the one who says, this gate doesn't have to stay closed. This watchtower doesn't have to be staffed every night. This moat doesn't have to drown anyone who tries to come close. Healing becomes historical renovation. You're not just healing for yourself. You're healing backwards, softening the stone in memories that don't even belong to you. And healing forwards, making sure your children don't inherit the same map of locked doors. Because the bravest act isn't building a castle. It's choosing which parts to keep and which to let crumble into something gentler. When castles become cages, at first you built it to survive. A wall to keep the pain out, a tower to watch for betrayal, a gate that only opened when everything felt safe, predictable, controlled. But then one day you noticed something strange. You hadn't stepped outside in a while, no one had come in either, and you weren't defending anymore. You were hiding, because when there's no enemy at the gate and you still won't open it, you're no longer in a fortress. You're in a prison. It happens quietly. You stop answering messages. You pull away from conversations. You rehearse responses instead of living them. You laugh without showing your teeth. You call it boundaries. But sometimes it's just fear wearing better clothes. You call it solitude. But deep down it's loneliness with a lock on it. You call it independence. But it's a script written by a younger version of you, one who only knew how to survive by staying small and unreachable. The truth is, the longer you live behind walls, the more you forget how to open doors. You forget what warmth feels like when it's mutual, what trust sounds like when it doesn't echo, what softness means when it doesn't come with a warning. You don't let people in, not because they're dangerous, but because you don't remember what it's like not to be on guard. And what's worse, you hold the key, but you've forgotten how to use it. No one told you that survival architecture has a shelf life, that a wall built for protection can, over time, become a barrier to becoming. That silence might have once been safety, but now it's just an empty hallway you pace every night. The castle that once kept you safe is now the reason no one really knows you. And that's the cruelest irony of all. You built it so no one could hurt you. But in the end, It only ensured no one could hold you either. Still, all is not lost, because the walls you built, you can unbuild them, stone by stone, word by word, moment by trembling moment. You don't have to tear it down. You don't have to set fire to everything. You just have to crack open a window, leave a candle in the doorway, let the drawbridge creak just a little, not to let others rush in, but to let yourself breathe out. And maybe for the first time in a long time, feel the air of a world that doesn't want to hurt you. Not everyone comes to conquer. Some come to stay, to sit, to soften the stone with their presence. And slowly your fortress becomes something else entirely. Not a weapon, not a warning, but a home. Leaving the castle, what happens when you finally step outside, it doesn't happen all at once. You don't fling the doors open and run into the light. You don't lower the drawbridge with a smile and arms wide. It's smaller than that. A breath, a hesitation, a hand resting on the doorframe just a little longer than usual. Maybe it's a moment when someone asks how you really are and you actually answer. Not perfectly, not all the way, but honestly. Maybe it's a memory that surfaces and instead of locking it away again, you let it sit beside you for a while. Not as a threat, just as a piece of you. And slowly something shifts. The echo inside your walls softens. The silence stops sounding safe and starts sounding empty. So one morning, maybe not even special, you take a step outside. Just one, it's brighter than you expected. Louder too. Your instincts scream to turn back, to shut the door, to tighten the gate, but you stay. You let the wind touch you. You let the world be what it is, messy, unpredictable, beautiful. No script. No armor, no fortress between you and the sky. You meet someone's eyes without scanning them for danger. You listen without preparing your defense. You speak and don't shrink at the sound of your own voice. It feels like forgetting, but it's really remembering who you were before fear built walls around you. You might go back inside later. That's okay. The point isn't to abandon the castle. The point is to learn that it's not the only place you're allowed to live. You're allowed to stand in the open. You're allowed to be seen. You're allowed to exist without explanation. And slowly, the world becomes less like a battlefield and more like a field you've never walked barefoot through, but always dreamed of. The castle still stands. It always will. But now it's not your world, just your resting place. Because once you've stepped outside, you realize you were never meant to spend your whole life behind stone. Building without walls, a life beyond the fortress. You don't always notice the moment the walls disappear. There's no trumpet, no ceremony, just a strange, quiet feeling. You're no longer afraid of being seen. Not all the time, not by everyone, but by enough people in enough moments, and that's everything. You find yourself talking, not performing, resting, not guarding, loving, not bargaining for safety. You still have boundaries, of course. But they're not made of stone anymore. They're made of choice, intention, care. You still need shelter sometimes, but it's not a fortress, it's a garden, something open, something living, something that invites instead of warns. And now when someone new arrives, you don't interrogate their purpose. You don't scan them for exits. You say, "Come in, you don't have to prove anything." You've stopped expecting everyone to leave. Because you've stopped believing you're unworthy of being stayed for. You begin to build differently, not higher, not thicker, but softer, wiser. You build trust slowly like planting trees. You build connection like sunlight, not forced, just present. You build rooms inside yourself that echo with laughter, not silence. Rooms where grief is allowed to sit without shame. Rooms where the past doesn't rule but is remembered gently like an old photograph in the hallway. And when someone asks, "Where's your castle now?" you smile. You point to your voice, your breath, your steady hands. You say, "I don't live in one anymore. I carry safety with me." Because the real fortress was never stone. It was self-worth, self-knowing, self-forgiveness, and they don't crumble, they don't rot, they don't need to intimidate anyone to last. They just stay, quiet, unshaken, enough. And so without walls to hold you in or fear to guide your hands, you finally do what no castle ever could. You live freely, fully, and forward. This is the end of the journey. not of the story, but of the walls that once shaped it. Now the world is yours to build in with light, with language, with love. And whatever you create next, it won't need a moat, it will simply need you.